What's happening in this country right now is not a new phenomenon. The righteous rage of Black Americans over their unforgivable treatment at the hands of police has spilled over into our streets before. Each time the unthinkable happens, we hear similar calls for reform. We certainly need more police body cameras, more civilian oversight committees, inherent bias training, and community-based policing. But these things alone clearly cannot stop the cycle of violence. So it's worth asking, what would it take to make real change? The Minneapolis PD pre-George Floyd was held up as an example of a reformed department. It was one of 6 cities to embrace the changes President Obama's DOJ recommended after the Ferguson unrest in 2014. But that didn't stop George Floyd from being killed. Until very recently, police departments were not required to report how many citizens were killed by their officers. Even now, it's not clear that all of them do, which means the best publicly available numbers come from databases maintained by journalists at The Washington Post and The Guardian. Those estimates show the numbers are remarkably stable over the last few years. If our best efforts at changing the way we police have failed, why not try simply doing less of it? The logic is simple. If we accept that policing is inherently dangerous and leads to shooting of civilians, less policing means fewer killings. But defunding the police has another benefit. All that saved money would be free to invest back into the community. Things like housing, employment, healthcare, trauma services, and after-school programs. For the cost of each suit of riot gear, a city could choose instead to fully protect 31 doctors and nurses. The idea is gaining momentum. Last week in Minneapolis, the city council announced that their reform efforts had failed, and they plan to disband their police department. And the mayors of New York and LA have both announced plans to cut the budgets of their departments and invest that money back into the community. The police you see on TV today certainly don't look like they used to. In the wake of Iraq and Afghanistan, police departments have been given access to all kinds of equipment originally designed to be used by our armed forces against enemy combatants. Images of officers in armored vehicles riding against crowds of unarmed citizens have become commonplace. That's partly down to an initiative known as the 1033 program, which has allowed billions of dollars worth of surplus military gear to be transferred to local police departments for free. Thousands of assault rifles, bayonets, grenade launchers, forced entry tools, and bomb detonator robots on American streets. Some studies have shown that just the presence of this equipment can make policing more violent and likely to target communities of color. While President Obama made some progress in restricting the transfer of military gear to cops, President Trump has reversed the rollback. Not only are we sending military gear directly from our armed forces to the police, but in some cases we permit them tactics which are banned even to soldiers in wartime. In 1993, the Geneva Convention classified tear gas as a chemical weapon and banned its use on the battlefield. And yet, its use by police forces across the country to break up crowds remains perfectly legal and widespread. It's not just the equipment, it's also a militaristic mentality that develops from training. John DiCarlo, a professor of criminal justice and an ex-officer who reformed his police force, says there are signs of a military culture in policing, an us versus them mentality, which is dangerous when translated to a community setting. Both of these issues could be easily addressed. Our police forces should not use the same equipment or tactics that our military uses on enemy combatants, on the very citizens they are sworn to protect. But there is a case to be made for going even further than that. Some experts argue we should completely disarm our police forces. While the idea may sound radical, there is precedent. You could argue that it's the UK's strict gun laws that make unarmed policing possible. But in Iceland, 15th in the world in gun ownership per capita, the police also patrol with only a baton. Some would say that it can work in Iceland because Iceland is a small, mostly homogeneous country with a strong social safety net, and thus little poverty and a low crime rate. Which brings us to our final point. Substantial research suggests countries with robust social safety nets experience less violent crime than those without. In the US, we have higher rates of murder, robbery, burglary, and rape than most other industrialized nations, perhaps partially because of our lack of safety net. The social safety net has outsized importance for black families because institutional racism is not limited to the police force. Over the last 30 years, black home ownership has actually decreased, while the wealth gap between white and black families is getting worse, not better. And staggeringly, the median net worth for black families is $3,557, or 2% of the median net worth for white families, which means that the average black family in America is one minor economic setback away from tragedy. A stronger safety net could help countless families avoid that tragedy. But politicians have been gutting those programs for decades. They say we can't afford it. They say food stamps dissuade poor people from trying to find jobs. They argue that paying a living wage would kill small businesses. Combine all of that with the over-policing of black Americans on drug charges, and you can start to understand why black Americans make up 12% of the overall population and 33% of the prison population. If the numbers don't convince you that a stronger safety net can save lives, maybe a story will. A 46-year-old man lived peacefully in Minnesota. He made an honest living working as a bouncer and truck driver. On March 28th, as the governor issued a stay-at-home order, shutting down the businesses he worked at, that man lost his job and his income. If he had lived in, say, Denmark, he would have qualified for up to 4 years of full unemployment benefits. But, for whatever reason, and partially because he lived here, he was accused of buying cigarettes with an allegedly counterfeit $20 bill. He was arrested, and then he was killed. His name was George.